you've probably heard of the 50-30-20 rule. The idea is simple. 50% of your income goes to needs, 30% goes to wants, and 20% goes to savings or investing. It's clean, it's easy to remember, and it's often presented as the baseline for responsible financial planning. If you follow it, you're supposedly budgeting the right way. But there's a problem. That rule assumes something about your expenses that often isn't true anymore. The reason this rule spreads so widely is because the logic behind it makes sense. It prevents people from spending everything on lifestyle. It guarantees that some money goes toward the future, and it creates a structure that's easy to follow. For someone with stable income and moderate living costs, the rule works as a simple guideline, and that simplicity is exactly why it became popular. You don't need spreadsheets. You don't need detailed financial planning. Just divide your income into 3 categories and stay within the percentages. But simple frameworks usually rely on assumptions. And when those assumptions change, the framework starts to break. The biggest assumption built into the rule is housing cost, because rent or mortgage payments fall into the needs category. And that category is supposed to stay within 50% of your income. But in many cities today, housing alone can take up 40, 50, or even 60% of someone's income. Once that happens, the structure of the rule collapses, because the 50% needs category wasn't designed to handle a single expense that large. It was meant to cover everything required to live: rent, groceries, transportation, insurance, all of it. But when housing absorbs most of that category, there's nothing left for the rest. If rent alone takes 50% of your income, the budget has already exceeded the rule before groceries, gas, or utilities even enter the picture. At that point, the framework forces one of 2 outcomes. Either the person breaks the rule, or they sacrifice something else. And most of the time, that something else becomes savings. Instead of 20% going toward long-term financial stability, it shrinks. Maybe 10%, maybe 5%, sometimes nothing at all. The framework didn't fail because people suddenly became irresponsible. It failed because the underlying costs changed. The rule was built around a cost structure where housing left enough room for everything else. When housing expands beyond that structure, the rule collapses under its own math. But here's the part that's rarely mentioned. The 50-30-20 rule didn't become popular because it was perfectly accurate. It became popular because it was easy to explain. A rule that fits into 3 numbers spreads faster than a budget that requires context. And once a rule becomes widely accepted, it keeps circulating even after the conditions that supported it disappear. So, what works better? Instead of forcing a fixed percentage rule, it helps to reverse the order. Start with the non-negotiable costs: housing, food, transportation, utilities, the things that must be paid for regardless of the budget structure. Once those are accounted for, then savings becomes a function of your real expenses, not an arbitrary percentage. For some people, that might still be 20%. For others, it might be 15 or 10. The point isn't the exact number. The point is that the structure reflects reality. This approach doesn't make budgeting as clean as the 50-30-20 rule, but it does make it more accurate, because financial advice works best when it adapts to the environment it's used in, not when it assumes the environment never changed. Budgets like the 50-30-20 rule aren't completely useless, but they were built for a different cost structure, a time when housing left enough room for everything else inside that 50% category. But when the structure changes, the rule needs to change with. The real goal of budgeting isn't to follow a formula. It's to build a system that works under the conditions you're actually living in.